In my intervention, what I want to focus is more on the implications of the outlook, and especially in the context, as it was mentioned before, we're living in a context of volatility. So as shown in the presentation, growth in the agricultural sector over the coming decades will be primarily driven by sustained productivity growth under, very important to mention, stable real prices, stable real prices. And that's something that we need to look at it carefully because not necessarily will be the case, but when we map the trends, that's what we obtain. So the future increases in incomes will rely less on market conditions and more on ability of production systems to perform under tighter margins. And that's what we are observing right now even. No? The input prices are going up, commodity prices are still low, very tight margins, but the system seems to be strong and resilient to try to move forward. And therefore, any enhancement in productivity is essential. And that's the whole goal behind and the major recommendation here. And if we want to do this type of enhancements of productivity, we cannot do generic recommendations. It means that we have to look carefully at countries' production systems and to understand where those efficiency gains will be the ones that will reduce the yield gaps, and in other cases where technology like mechanization, innovation in digital technologies, the use of artificial intelligence, and market integration and market access will allow us to finance these type of activities. So the challenges are not simple to raise productivity, but to identify the key constraints and to address what are the required interventions and investments that are needed to be able to achieve that. And we also want to achieve a second goal, which is increase efficiency in emissions, so reduction of emissions, while we have to keep producing more. So here is where the diagnostic part is essential, and the work that we have to do is to try to focus on targeting specific bottlenecks, targeting where there are opportunities, where there are inefficiencies in policies, and at the same time identifying what are the proper policies that allows productivity enhancing investments to become a driver of both growth and resilience in this increasing volatile environment. And achieving this requires significant inputs and combining not only the outputs, but also looking at the input market. It's very interesting to see after the war in Ukraine, many countries start to build up plans in terms of inputs, especially fertilizers. Sadly, when the Strait of Hormuz was closed, we were able to assess that none of those plans were implemented. And very dramatic cases in big exporting countries in the south of South America, but also in Europe, which came up later, and now they have launched the new plan. So the outlook is also a reminder that the path of this trend is not guaranteed unless we do the changes. When the margins are tight, volatility in input prices, weather, and commodity markets has a much greater impact in outcomes. And the challenge, therefore, is not only to raise productivity, but also to ensure productivity-led growth remains resilient to future shocks. And at FAO, we keep calling that this is a system, the agri-food system, that is under risk and uncertainties. Uncertainties, we don't know. They will come, and we have to cope with them. That's capacity of absorption, capacity of resilience. Risks, we know. For example, El Niño, we knew. Strait of Hormuz, we didn't know. It was a surprise. So we need to be prepared for those. And that's the only way these trends will become reality and we will reduce that volatility. Now, we need to understand also how these volatilities are happening and what are behind them. And I think the outlook incorporates a short-term analysis of higher oil and fertilizer prices, highlighting that the key concern is not only higher costs today, but their impact on future production. You know, today we observe, for example, that oil prices, Brent oil is at 72.4, I think, despite still there is conflict happening in that area. So you ask the question, just the signal that there was a peace agreement will reduce the price of Brent oil? And the answer is no. It's very far from the signal. It is because consumption has been adjusted because of the supply shock. So demand is very close to what we have in COVID-19. And at the same time, there was a significant release of oil from China, which has an excess of reserves. So they release also urea. So it's sometimes very complex to understand these dynamics of the markets, which are more complex. And that's where we need to work strongly to try to understand those so that we can make a transparent system. And that's also the role of the Agricultural Market Information System that is trying to bring that transparency in the system. And also resilience depends on improving efficiency use. And we continue to promote, for example, soil mapping. Why? Because what you need in inputs and the blending you use is the difference between what you plant and what the soil has. And I am sure Waganin can know very well this. So that's what we need. But if we don't know what the soil has, then how we can do a proper blending? And typically the blending is just automatic, 30, 30, 40 of NPK. No? And there is a lot of waste of fertilizers, and we are making especially smallholders to spend money in things that won't create a change in yields. And that's where we need to work carefully. But also we need to reduce asymmetries of information. When people come out and say that Africa is going to go to hunger because of the fertilizer prices, that's not necessarily correct, no? Because the intensity of use of fertilizers in Africa is very low. So some countries have high intensity, but yields won't be affected so much as it will be affected in big producing countries that require those inputs. Of course, there are countries that will be impacted. Nobody's saying that they are not. But it's not the major reason why they will increase the hunger situation. So again, I think we need to look at this very carefully. And the other side of the equation is the demand side, no? And the outlook projects continued dietary diversification in many middle-income countries as incomes rise over the coming decades. However, on the demand side, progress remains much slower in low-income countries where affordability constraints continue to limit access to more diverse nutrition diets. And we have seen that in the number of people that cannot access a healthy diet. No, it's 2.4 billion, it's close to a third of the overall population. This number goes up, especially in Africa and in some parts of Southern Asia. So again, if there is this transformation and income starts to grow higher in those countries, of course, the request and the demand will increase the pressure over other types of commodities, not only over cereals, but also, of course, over high-value commodities. That's what the diversity of the diet we need. So there is a lot of potential here to look at opportunities that will increase also this demand, that will allow farmers also to have better prices so that we can match what the demand requires and that which push you towards a healthy diet, towards the supply is trying to do that. So the outlook also highlights the need to move from a broader environmental commitments to practical policy design. While productivity gains reduce emission intensity, total direct emissions from the agriculture and the agri-food system is still projected to rise as production expands. Managing these trade-offs requires aligning incentives and investment decisions with environmental objectives. This also depends on stronger data systems, harmonized metrics, and integrated modeling so that we understand the consequence of the actions. So our motto, for example, in FAO is good food for all for today and tomorrow. And the tomorrow is the reduction of those trade-offs, those hidden costs that we have been working so that we can understand what are the consequences of those reactions. So if a country wants to switch from intensity of production that creates a lot of emissions to lower intensity to create lower emissions, we need at the same time to assure that they can provide the food security that is needed and they can supply to the world what they were supplying. So without credible and comparable data, it becomes much more harder to design effective incentives, assess trade-offs, and support realistic pathways toward lower emissions and agri-food system. And that's where the outlook is extremely helpful, as well all the work we are doing together with OECD. Finally, the outlook confirms that trade will remain essential. And trade has been more complex now. It's more complex because of geopolitics. We are moving from supplies that are supply chains which are just in time to supply chains which are just in case. And that brings a lot of inefficiency to the world. And that is where we need to keep working very hard to try to not only looking at increasing access, but also to looking at the infrastructure and the logistical choke points. Today, what we have learned since COVID-19, then the war in Ukraine, now the Panama Canal, and then now the Strait of Hormuz, is that if we don't incorporate transportation, logistics, and operations in any analysis we do in trade at a very detailed level, we need to know what is moving, how it is moving, what are alternative routes, we won't be able to bring this together, and that's what a clear message is sent by this report. So achieving sustainable food security will depend on how well we manage the interactions and trade-offs between production, consumption, and market systems and their increasingly binding constraints. This is where analytical work, evidence-based policies, and international cooperation must continue to focus, and we must not assume it's a given. Data is costly, and data gives us light. If we start switching off the lights by not providing resources for data, then we will be working in a darker world where we don't know where we are moving and what are the policies doing. So it's very important that we bring this up and we keep strengthening our cooperation and these capabilities of modeling and data that allow us to bring light to the process of decision, which today, with risk and uncertainties in the world, is even more important than in the past. Thank you.